The war did not pause for disagreement, it pressed forward regardless of pride, hesitation, or reputation. In the late summer of 1944, Allied armies stood on the edge of what should have been decisive momentum. German resistance was collapsing unevenly, roads into the heart of Western Europe lay open. Fuel was scarce, but opportunity was not, and yet, the advance slowed. At the center of the hesitation was a man who believed delay was discipline. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood firm behind his plan, methodical, controlled, deliberate. He insisted that speed without certainty invited disaster. Others saw something else forming, a narrowing corridor of authority. A concentration of power that left little room for dissent. While Allied columns waited, German forces regrouped, reinforced, and recovered their balance. At Supreme Headquarters, pressure built quietly. American commanders questioned the pace, British leaders defended it. Dwight Eisenhower listened to both and satisfied neither. He was holding together an alliance that depended on trust while watching time slip away. Every day of delay hardened German defenses. Every hour made future victories more expensive. Someone would have to yield, someone would lose influence. The alliance itself was beginning to strain. Montgomery did not see himself as obstructing victory, he saw himself as protecting it. His caution was rooted in experience, in memories of earlier disasters where haste had invited catastrophe. He believed that precision, not speed, would end the war. But wars do not wait for consensus, they punish hesitation as surely as recklessness. Behind closed doors, doubts grew sharper. American generals worried that the opportunity to break Germany outright was being wasted. Supply shortages worsened, units sat idle while enemy forces rebuilt behind rivers and fortified cities. The sense of urgency clashed with Montgomery's insistence on preparation. The crisis was not loud. There were no shouting matches, no public rebukes. It unfolded through memoranda, restrained conversations, and the growing silence between commanders who no longer trusted one another's judgment. The unresolved question hung over every meeting. How long could delay be justified before it became failure? The stakes were never confined to a single operation. The Allied advance depended on momentum. Lose it, and the war would drag on into winter. Lose it, and casualties would multiply. Lose it, and political confidence already fragile would erode. Governments had promised their publics progress. Delay required explanation. Explanation required unity. Resignation was not unthinkable. Several senior officers privately considered it. Not as protest, but as escape from a command structure they believed was becoming rigid and unresponsive. Collapse did not need defeat to occur. It could emerge from paralysis. Normal solutions offered nothing. Eisenhower could not simply overrule Montgomery without destabilizing British confidence. He could not accelerate the advance without accepting risks that Montgomery refused to bear. Compromise only slowed decisions further. This was no small disagreement over tactics. It was a collision between philosophies of command, between caution and momentum, between control and trust. And the longer it continued, the more it threatened to fracture the war effort from within. To understand how the Allies reached this point, it was necessary to step backward. Montgomery's reputation had been built on caution rewarded. His victory at El Alamein was methodical, rehearsed, and deliberate. It restored British confidence after years of retreat. That success shaped everything that followed. Montgomery learned that patience brought praise and preparation brought power. He carried that lesson into every command. He demanded centralized control. He resisted rapid advances unless every variable had been accounted for. To him, uncertainty was the enemy. But war is built on uncertainty, and Allied command was filled with men who believed adaptability mattered more than control. Tensions with American commanders were not new. They had surfaced in North Africa and Sicily. Each time, compromise papered over disagreement. Each time, resentment deepened. Montgomery viewed American generals as impulsive. Americans viewed him as obstructive. Both believed the other misunderstood modern warfare. Eisenhower had balanced these personalities through diplomacy rather than force. He believed harmony mattered more than speed. But diplomacy had limits. It relied on goodwill, and goodwill was eroding. The trigger came not through confrontation, but through delay itself. As Allied forces paused, German commanders exploited the reprieve. Defensive lines hardened, counterattacks intensified. What had once been an opportunity for collapse became a fight for every mile. Reports reached headquarters detailing missed chances. Roads unused, bridges unsized, cities fortified. The language remained restrained, but the implications were clear. Delay was no longer neutral, it was shaping the battlefield in Germany's favor. Reaction was swift but contained. American generals expressed concern. British leadership closed ranks. Montgomery defended his timetable. Eisenhower absorbed the pressure and delayed decision. Each day without resolution increased the cost of eventual action. Escalation followed. Political leaders demanded answers. The press sensed hesitation. Rumors circulated of internal division. Allied unity, once unquestioned, now required reassurance. Private conversations grew tense. Trust thinned. The atmosphere became claustrophobic. No option satisfied everyone. Accelerate and risk disaster. Delay and risk stagnation. Override Montgomery and risk alliance rupture. Support him and risk prolonging the war. Eisenhower faced the impossible choice. He could not do both. One path would preserve political balance but surrender momentum. The other would restore speed but fracture trust. Every alternative carried consequences beyond his control. The compromise that emerged was unsatisfying by design. Montgomery retained influence. Advances continued, but cautiously. The crisis was managed, not resolved. It solved the immediate tension, but preserved the underlying conflict. In the aftermath, nothing appeared broken. The alliance held, operations continued, yet relationships had changed. Confidence was conditional, patience was exhausted. The cost of delay was now measured in future casualties rather than immediate disaster. Long-term consequences followed quietly. German defenses solidified. The war extended into winter. Casualties increased. Strategic opportunities narrowed. Montgomery's reputation remained intact publicly, but privately it was questioned. Eisenhower's authority endured, but it carried scars. History would later debate whether delay was justified. Participants rarely agreed. What remained undeniable was the impact. Decisions made in restraint reshaped the remainder of the war. The real lesson was not about speed or caution. It was about power exercised under the guise of professionalism, about how ego hides behind method. About how alliances fail not through open conflict, but through hesitation that no one dares to challenge. The war was won, but the cost of delay lingered long after victory. The crisis did not end with resolution, it settled into the fabric of Allied command, shaping every decision that followed. What had been a disagreement over tempo became a permanent recalibration of trust. Officers adjusted not only their plans, but their expectations of one another. Words were measured, assumptions were withheld. Cooperation continued, but without ease. The stakes now extended beyond geography. They reached into credibility. Every delay required justification. Every justification was examined for motive. The alliance was still intact, but it was no longer confident. It moved forward cautiously, aware that unity had become conditional. Montgomery remained convinced that history would vindicate him. To his mind, the war had proven repeatedly that overreach destroyed armies. He believed his critics underestimated German resilience and overstated Allied strength. He saw his approach as insurance against catastrophe. What he did not fully acknowledge was how delay altered the strategic landscape itself. Time favored the defender. Each pause allowed German forces to reorganize. Commanders replaced losses. Supply lines stabilized. Defensive doctrine adapted to Allied methods. The enemy learned not through defeat, but through observation. The cost of caution was paid later, in harder fights and longer campaigns. Eisenhower understood this calculus. He also understood that removing Montgomery outright would fracture British confidence at a moment when cohesion mattered more than speed. His authority depended on balance. He was not simply commanding armies. He was managing egos, governments, and public expectations simultaneously. Pressure continued to arrive from Washington. American leadership grew impatient with what they perceived as unnecessary restraint. Casualty projections climbed. Winter loomed. The political cost of delay was becoming as dangerous as military risk. Yet every attempt to impose urgency risked reopening the crisis Eisenhower had just contained. Montgomery's influence, while preserved, was no longer absolute. Subtle adjustments began to appear. American commanders were given greater latitude. Alternative plans were explored quietly. The command structure remained intact, but its center of gravity shifted. The impossible choice had not vanished. It had simply been deferred. As operations resumed, friction manifested in small ways. Coordination slowed. Requests were scrutinized. Decisions required more approval than before. Trust, once broken, does not announce its absence. It reveals itself through hesitation. The war moved forward, but without the sense of inevitability that had once defined the Allied advance. Each success was hard-earned. Each setback carried echoes of what might have been avoided. The cost of earlier restraint became visible not in failure, but in attrition. Montgomery's reputation endured publicly. He remained a symbol of British resolve. Yet among Allied commanders, admiration mixed with resentment. His insistence on control was now seen as rigidity, his caution as self-protection. The line between professionalism and ego blurred. Eisenhower's leadership was tested repeatedly. He had preserved unity, but at the expense of decisiveness. Some questioned whether a firmer hand earlier might have shortened the war. Others argued that without compromise, the alliance might have fractured entirely. There were no clean answers. What followed was not collapse, but recalibration. The Allied command adapted to its own limitations. Plans accounted for internal friction. Expectations were lowered. Cooperation became procedural rather than instinctive. German commanders sensed the change. They exploited pauses, contested advances, and forced the Allies into battles of attrition rather than maneuver. The opportunity for rapid collapse had passed. The war became slower, heavier, and more expensive. In retrospect, the delay was neither singular nor catastrophic. It was cumulative. Each day added weight. Each hesitation compounded risk. The cost was paid incrementally, measured in miles not taken and lives later lost. Montgomery never conceded error. He maintained that his methods prevented disaster. History would debate his judgment endlessly. What remained indisputable was the effect his insistence had on Allied dynamics. Authority once centralized became contested. Confidence once assumed became conditional. The alliance survived, but it was altered. The war was still won, but without the clarity that early momentum promised. Victory arrived through endurance rather than decisiveness. The long-term consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Post-war narratives softened tensions, but memories endured among those who had lived them. Trust once strained never fully returned. Professional respect remained, but warmth did not. This was the quiet cost of command politics. Not defeat, but erosion. Not collapse, but fatigue. Alliances do not fail loudly. They weaken through compromise that satisfies no one. As the war dragged on, the lesson became clear to those paying attention. Leadership is not only about avoiding risk, it is about recognizing when restraint becomes its own danger. About understanding that delay, when motivated by reputation as much as prudence, carries consequences no plan can fully control. The Allies would adapt, push forward, and ultimately prevail. But the war they almost lost was not lost on a battlefield. It was nearly lost in rooms where decisions were postponed, authority contested, and trust quietly withdrawn. By the time the final campaigns took shape, the alliance had learned how to function under strain. It no longer assumed harmony, it managed disagreement. Plans were written with contingencies not just for the enemy, but for internal resistance. The command system still worked, but it worked defensively. Montgomery's position was secure on paper. He retained authority, prestige, and public confidence at home, yet his influence was now bounded. His proposals were weighed differently, support was conditional. Where once his caution had been treated as wisdom, it was now treated as preference. The distinction mattered. American commanders adjusted their expectations. They no longer waited for unanimity, they prepared parallel plans. They pushed where they could and accepted delay where they must. Cooperation became transactional, efficient, but emotionally hollow. Eisenhower carried the burden of this system. His success lay not in brilliance, but in endurance. He absorbed criticism from both sides and rarely answered it. He accepted that leadership in a coalition meant being resented by everyone at different times. His authority survived, but it was never again unquestioned. As operations continued, the war's tempo reflected these compromises. Advances came, but slower. Breakthroughs occurred, but were exploited cautiously. Opportunities were seized only when consensus allowed. The enemy, though weakening, was never allowed to collapse suddenly. German resistance stiffened where time permitted. Defensive depth increased, withdrawals were conducted with discipline. Each pause granted the defenders another chance to adapt. The price was paid in prolonged fighting rather than decisive maneuver. History often measures success in outcomes. The Allies won. Europe was liberated. Germany surrendered. From a distance, the delays blur into inevitability. But for those inside the command structure, the memory was sharper. They remembered what speed might have achieved. They remembered how close momentum came to stalling. Montgomery's legacy became divided. In Britain, he remained a symbol of methodical victory. In Allied councils, he was remembered as difficult, immovable, and deeply conscious of his own image. Neither view was false. Together, they formed a portrait of a commander shaped as much by ego as by experience. The alliance itself bore scars. Trust did not collapse, but it thinned. Future cooperation relied more on procedure than instinct. The ease of early success was gone. What replaced it was professionalism without warmth. Words spoken in private rooms echoed longer than shells fired at the front. Delays justified as prudence became arguments about control. Control became a proxy for prestige. Prestige became inseparable from national pride. The war effort absorbed these tensions, but it did not escape them. Looking back, the crisis was never about a single delay. It was about authority in a coalition. About how far one man could push caution before it became obstruction. About how leaders protect reputations while claiming to protect lives. No one resigned. No alliance fractured openly. That is why the moment is often overlooked, but near failures rarely announce themselves. They pass quietly, leaving altered behavior in their wake. The war the Allies almost lost was not lost because decisions were wrong. It was nearly lost because decisions were deferred, because consensus replaced momentum. Because no one could afford to force the issue without risking something larger. Montgomery believed delay saved lives. His critics believed delay cost them. Both arguments contained truth. What neither side could fully measure was the cost to trust. Once eroded, it never fully returned. The final victory belonged to endurance. Not to speed, not to clarity. Endurance compensated for hesitation. Resources compensated for time. Lives compensated for delay. In the end, the alliance proved strong enough to survive its own divisions. But strength is not the same as harmony. Success is not the same as unity. The war was won, but the confidence that once held the alliance together without question was lost forever.